Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Today is the very last day of February, and that is the day that I start my brassica seeds. So I've been starting kale, cabbage, I will be starting broccoli and cauliflower tonight. So there's lots of seed starting going on today. So this video today is going to be kind of a companion video to a video that I filmed about a week ago. In that video, I kind of did like a seed starting 101 where I went through the basics of seed starting and we started a lot of peppers together. If you missed that video, I'm going to go ahead and link that in the video description because there's a lot of good information in that video too. Today we are going to be focusing specifically on common seed starting mistakes and how to avoid them. So I'm going to go through 8 of what I think are probably the most common seed starting mistakes, and we're just going to talk about how you make sure that you don't make those mistakes. So the first one that I am going to start with, this is the mistake that I personally am most guilty of, so I'm going to start with that one. And that is starting your seeds too early. So I'm also going to throw starting your seeds too late into the same mistake, and we'll just talk about starting seeds at the wrong time. Personally, I tend to start my seeds too early, or at least I have to fight the temptation to start my seeds too early. I have definitely started them too early more than once in the past, and while it's kind of almost irresistible when you're just feeling that need for spring and you're just hoping for the spring garden to come sooner, it's very hard to resist that urge to start seeds too early, but it's something that causes a lot more problems and can also be detrimental to the health of your plants. Now, the reason you want to avoid starting your seeds too early, that may seem like a great thing, like, oh, my plants are going to get more of a head start, I'm going to get a harvest sooner. And while in some cases that might be true, a lot of times what happens is that your plant is going to grow to an unmanageable size. For example, tomatoes tend to grow really fast, and tomatoes are big plants once they really get going. And if you start your seeds too early, what can happen is your tomato plant just grows out of control. And especially if you're starting a lot of tomato plants, I'm going to be starting a couple dozen tomato plants at my house. And if I started them now, they would be way too big, and I would run out of space under my grow lights before it was time to get them outside. They'd be ready to get outside, but the weather outside wouldn't be ready for them. So what would happen is I would have to up-pot them into large pots, or else they'd stay in their little pots and the plants would end up suffering. So as tempting as it is to give your plants a little extra head start, it is not in their or your best interest to start them too early. So basically we're going to talk about how you know when to start your seeds. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to want to look up the last frost date in your area. So that's basically going to be the last expected date that you will most likely get a frost where the temperature will go below 32 degrees in your area. It's going to vary all over the place depending on where in the country you are. So I just like to go online and do a search using my zip code and last frost date. The Farmer's Almanac is a great website to check, but there are lots of other websites that will give you a good estimate as well. So once you know your last frost date, what you want to do is take a look at the seed packet of whatever it is that you're starting, and that will tell you how early to start your seeds. So for example, tomatoes usually say about 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. Peppers may say 8 to 10 weeks before your last frost date, in some cases even 8 to 12 weeks before your last frost date. Brassicas will say 4 to 6 weeks before you plan to plant them out, which for me, I plant them out in my garden a few weeks before my last frost date. They can withstand a light frost, so I usually plant them out the middle of April. So what you want to do, once you know your last frost date and once you know how early to start that specific variety, you're going to find your calendar and count backward that many weeks, and that will give you a ballpark of the best time to start your seeds. So another really common seed starting mistake is watering your plants either too much or too little. Personally, I think watering too much is probably a little more common, but watering too much or too little can really have a negative impact on your plants. Now, obviously, if you don't water enough, your plants are going to dehydrate and die. That's obviously something you do not want to happen. If you water too much, though, there are still risks. Basically, when your plant sends down roots into the soil, it's looking for a couple things. One thing it's looking for is nutrients from the soil. It's also looking for water from the soil. But another thing that they really need to have access to in the soil is air. And so by planting them in a nice, fluffy, loose soil that has air pockets, you are providing your plants with all of those things. But if you really waterlog the soil and you overwater them, what's going to happen is all those air pockets are going to fill up with water. Your plants are going to eventually drown. The roots could rot. They could be subject to disease. There's a lot of negative things that can happen from overwatering. So there's a couple things that I like to do to avoid over or underwatering. One is that you want to know what soil should look like when it's the proper moisture for plants. Now, if you take a handful of soil and you squeeze it, what you want is for that soil to be moist enough that it sticks together. If it just kind of crumbles and falls apart, it does not have enough water in it. On the other hand, if you squeeze it and water drips out of it and you are able to actually wring moisture out of that soil, then it's too wet. So what you want to do is be able to squeeze it, have it kind of form a clump in your hand that stays together, but not have any water actually wring out of it. Now, obviously, once you have plants growing in the soil, you're not going to be able to pull the soil out and do that test. So what you want to kind of do is familiarize yourself ahead of time when you first start your seeds with what that soil moisture level looks like so that you can recognize it once your plants are actually growing in it. Now, the other thing that I find really helpful when it comes to providing my plants the right amount of water is bottom watering. Now, I always grow my plants in a tray kind of like this. I grow in a few different types of trays, but I always have them in some sort of tray at the bottom that holds water. And when I go to water these plants, I'm not going to pour water into these individual cells. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add water into this tray. And then before the seeds germinate, the soil in these pots can really suck up the water. Once your seeds have germinated, then they send their roots down and the roots themselves can actually suck up the moisture. So what I do is I just add water to these trays. I'll add a little bit of water and then I will monitor the plants. Once the top of the soil looks moist, if there's still water remaining in this tray, I'll pour off the extra because you don't want them sitting in that water for too long. Now, when your seeds are first germinating, before you actually have seedlings, you want your soil to be consistently moist all the way through, all the way up to the top, because those seeds really need moisture to germinate, and if the soil dries out, they will either germinate a lot more slowly or in some cases not germinate at all. So you want to keep it pretty consistently moist while they're germinating. Once your seeds have sprouted and your plants have been growing for a little bit, you have a little bit more mature seedlings, at that point they will have sent their roots down into the soil. And what becomes more important at that time is making sure that the lower level of the soil is moist. The roots will be reaching downward and you want them to have moist soil to get to. So that's another reason why bottom watering is really important. If you have seedlings and you water them from the top, the soil can look moisturized enough, but only the surface is wet sometimes. What you want to do is get used to feeling the moisture level of the soil below the surface. So if you reach down about an inch or two below the surface, you want to feel moisture there. You don't want only the surface level to be moist because the roots will be down towards the bottom of the container, and you want them to be down at the bottom of the container because that's going to promote a healthy plant. So you want to make sure that you're watering them enough that the roots at the bottom get the moisture they need. And that same principle actually applies to plants out in the garden too, but we will get into that more as the gardening season goes on. So for now, my two main takeaways when it comes to water are get to know what properly moisturized soil looks like, and definitely bottom water. It's going to make your life a lot easier and make your plants a lot healthier. So the third really common mistake I want to talk about when it comes to seed starting is letting your plants, letting your little seedlings get leggy. Basically what that means is that when they first sprout, it's caused by insufficient lighting. And what that means is when your plants first sprout, they'll be reaching up towards the light. They'll get really, really tall, but they will not be strong. They'll be tall, they'll be leaning, they'll be floppy. Their stems aren't tall because they're just reaching for the light. So the best way to prevent that is to make sure that they have adequate lighting. Now, you can, in theory, start your seedlings in a bright window. I find that that's not usually an ideal situation unless you have very bright lighting. Now, obviously, if you have a greenhouse, those plants will be getting light from all directions, and it's very bright sunlight coming from overhead too. So that's a great ideal situation for your plants. But if they're in your house and you just have one window, even if it's a nice bright south-facing window, often that's not going to be enough light for them to really get the maximum amount of sunlight that they need. If you think about it, it's kind of the equivalent of planting your plants outside in the shade, where they get sunlight coming in, but not a lot of sunlight directly shining on them. And most of the plants that you'll be planting in a vegetable garden are not shade-loving plants, they're sun-loving plants. So I like to grow my plants under grow lights. Now, you do not need any kind of fancy, expensive grow light. Fancy, expensive grow lights may result in healthier plants, and if you have the resources to get those, then go for it. My lights are actually very cheap. So I just have basic shop lights like the kind you can get at Home Depot, and my plants grow perfectly fine in those. Now, again, I would probably get slightly better results if I had more expensive lights, but for the size garden I have and for what I'm doing, those shop lights do the job for me. So I leave them on my plants probably about, depending on the day, between 12 to 16 hours a day. Closer to 16 is best. You do want to make sure that you give them several hours of a break without light, just to kind of mimic the nighttime outside. I actually grow my seedlings right in my bedroom, so the light is always off while I'm sleeping. So that makes it really easy to remember to turn on and off. You also want to make sure that your light source is not too far from your plants. When your seeds first germinate, you want your light to only be a few inches above the tops of the plants. As the seedlings grow and get taller, they can have a little more space because they're stronger, and that's fine. But in the beginning, if you want to avoid leggy plants, you definitely want to have your light as close as possible. Now, if you do end up with leggy plants, in some cases you can kind of help correct that problem, at least to some extent, when you transplant your seedlings into larger pots. So depending on what kind of plant you're growing, go ahead and look up if planting it more deeply will be helpful. For example, tomatoes. Tomatoes are so forgiving. If you end up with leggy tomato seedlings, you can go ahead and when you transplant them, plant them nice and deep. So depending on how tall your plant is, the first few inches of stem will be covered by soil, and that will help fix the problem of leggy tomato seedlings. That doesn't work for all plants. So depending on the specific plant you're growing, just go ahead and do a search and find out if that is a good solution for the type of plant you're growing. The fourth seed starting mistake that I want to talk about today is not thinning your seedlings. Now, I get it. When you have started seedlings and both the seedlings and your cells sprout, they both look beautiful and healthy, it can be so hard to pinch off one of those plants. But it really is important because, so look at these little tiny cells here. This is a little 4-pack that I've started of Savoy cabbage. Now look at this tiny little amount of growing space. In each of these cells, I planted 2 seeds. I do that because there's always a chance that some seeds won't germinate. So by planting 2, you're almost guaranteed to get at least 1 healthy plant in each cell. Another reason I do that is because sometimes you get a plant that sprouts and it's just not as healthy as the others. If you have a second seed in that cell, you're more likely to get at least 1 that looks nice and healthy. But of course, then you're left with the problem of having to choose between them. Now, if I left both seedlings to grow in each of these little cells in this seed container here, what would happen? I mean, look at how small that is. There's only so much space. There's only so much, or there are only so many resources in that small little pot. There's only so much moisture. There's only so many nutrients. There's only a little bit of growing space. If I left them both in there, what would happen is both plants would suffer. And so as heartbreaking as it can be, it is really important to thin your seedlings. So in addition to competing for the limited resources in that small space, if you have plants planted too close together, what can happen is that as they grow, they're really going to be in each other's space. There's going to be a lot less airflow, and when there's less airflow, that is breeding grounds for disease. And that can lead to, obviously, your plants getting disease, not being healthy. In some cases, they may even die, and you could lose both plants. Now, depending on the type of seedling it is, sometimes you have a couple choices there. Sometimes you could go ahead and take out one of the seedlings and transplant it into another pot, and then you would be able to save both of them. If it's something, in this case, kale and cabbage, these are both delicious little plants to eat. So when I thin these out, I just pull one out and I eat it. It's like a tiny little microgreen, and it's delicious. It's pretty much your earliest harvest in the garden, so it's a nice little bonus. If you aren't going to try to transplant out any extra seedlings, the easiest way to thin them and the best way to thin them is just to take a tiny pair of scissors and just snip one of them off right above the soil surface. If you pull the plant out rather than snipping it, what's likely to happen, the roots may be entangled in that soil with the plant that you want to keep. And if you pull one of them out, what could end up happening is you could end up damaging the roots of the healthy plant that you've chosen to keep. So it is a little better to actually snip the plant rather than pull it out. So the next common mistake that I want to talk about is a really easy to fix problem with a really obvious solution, and that mistake is not labeling your plants. So today I started a lot of seedlings that look really similar to each other. I've got kale and cabbage, and I will be starting broccoli and cauliflower. Those plants, when they first come up, are very difficult to tell apart until they start to get their true leaves. And even when they get their true leaves, it would be almost impossible to tell apart my different broccoli varieties from each other. So it is really important to go ahead and label, unless you don't mind a lot of surprises in the garden. But the thing is, when I transplant these plants into the garden, I'm going to be giving them different spacing based on what they are. I'm going to be giving them slightly different treatment in the garden. And so if you want to give your plant the right treatment, you want to make sure that you know what it is. So I find that the best way for me to label it, sometimes if I have lighter colored containers, I'll just write directly on the container with a Sharpie. These containers are black, so Sharpie wouldn't really show up. So I just put these little labels in here. And then on the back of each label, you probably can't even see that on the camera, I wrote in pencil on the other side, because what happens is that Sharpie tends to fade in the sun and pencil holds up a little bit better. But Sharpie's obviously a lot easier to read at a quick glance. So I write on both sides of the tag and do Sharpie on one, pencil on the other. So I just go ahead, write out the label, and I stick it in there before I even put seeds in there. That way you know for sure what you're planted. So the next seed starting mistake, and I know I said the first one was the one that I'm most guilty of, but I'm also guilty of this one too. This is not planting ahead with space. Now, in the video that I posted about a week ago, we planted a lot of peppers together. We planted lots of pepper varieties. So what I did is I planted multiple peppers in each cell, and my plan is to transplant out the extras once they start to grow a little bit. That's one plant that, as we kind of mentioned before, you can thin by transplanting. So that's what I plan to do with my peppers. But the thing is that right now I have 1 or 2 little pots of each pepper variety. As they all come up and I transplant them out, the amount of space that those plants are taking up is going to multiply exponentially. Now, right now, I may have 3 peppers in the same pot. Once I transplant those out into their own separate pots, they're going to take up 3 times as much space. If you also have plants that you start in small pots, you're eventually going to up-pot them into larger pots. You just want to go ahead and think ahead about how much space your plants are ultimately going to take up before you're able to get them out in the garden. So I kind of do a little dance every year where I'm kind of shuffling things around, moving plants in and out of the house and into different spots, and it's not really ideal. So you want to go ahead and plan ahead for the amount of space, not that your baby seedlings will take up, but the amount of space that your transplants will take up right before they're ready to go into the garden. So the 7th common seed starting mistake that I want to talk about today is not starting the right kind of plants. Now, if you're new to gardening and you're new to seed starting, you want to kind of familiarize yourself with what type of plants need to be started inside. There's many kinds of plants that actually do a lot better if you sow the seeds directly outside. And it's actually in many cases not recommended to start them inside. There are some other plants where you can start them inside, but you don't need to. So don't make the mistake of thinking that you need to start all your seeds inside when some of them do just as well started outside. Now, for example, carrots and actually most root vegetables in general do a lot better if you plant the seeds directly out in the garden where they're going to grow and spend their whole lives. Now, there are some exceptions. For example, onions. Onions do need to be started ahead inside, but most root vegetables prefer to be planted where they're ultimately going to grow, because what you're harvesting that plant for is the root, and you don't want that root to be disturbed. Now, again, go ahead and look up the specific plant variety that you're growing to find out if what you're growing is something that should be direct sown outside. But like I said, carrots, most root vegetables. Now, I suppose you could technically start peas and beans early inside if you want to, but I really don't think it's worth it in most cases, because peas can be started outside so early anyway. I'm in Connecticut, so I'm not even in a warm area. And depending on the weather that year, I usually start my peas outside between mid-March to early April. So peas can be started outside, and I usually grow hundreds of pea plants. Starting those inside would take a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of space, and there's really no reason when you can just stick a seed in the ground, water it, and that's it. Similarly with beans, I suppose you probably could start those inside, but you really don't need to. They do really well being direct sown. Those you do need to wait until the frost has passed and the ground is warmed up, but you can just stick your bean seeds directly outside and they grow. Now, there are some plants that can kind of go either way. For example, cucumbers. For the most part, cucumbers like to be direct sown exactly where they're going to grow, but you can go ahead and start those inside if you want to get a little bit of a head start. I am actually going to be starting my cucumbers inside this year. I don't usually do that But last year I had an issue with a pest that was coming along, and as soon as my seeds germinated outside in the garden, it would come along and nip the top off. Every one of those seeds just went on down the row and ate all my cucumber seedlings. Now, I don't want that to happen again. So what I'm probably going to do is start some seeds inside of my cucumbers and direct sow some outside, and we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll end up with a lot of cucumber plants. But either way, we'll see what happens. Now, zucchinis. I used to start my zucchini seeds inside, but I found with experience that they're usually more successful direct sown. So again, if you want to get a little bit of a head start, go ahead and start those inside, but you really don't have to. So the final seed starting mistake I want to talk about today isn't really as much about starting your seeds as it is about just keeping them healthy as they grow. And that mistake is not hardening off your plants. Now, hardening off is a gardening term that basically means to take your seedlings that have been growing inside in a very sheltered environment and acclimating them gradually to the outdoors. Now, if you took those seedlings, say you're growing them inside your house, they have your grow light, you're watering them consistently, they're not having to deal with a lot of wind or rain or weather conditions or harsh sunlight, they're not really having to deal with anything. They have pretty luxurious lives. If you take those plants and you just stick them outside in the garden with no transition time, they're going to go into shock and not know what to do. Most likely the leaves will get sunburnt, they could get windburn as well. They're just not going to be able to, they're not going to really be able to deal with the change in temperature when they're used to a fairly consistent temperature in your house. This is the point where you've babied your seedlings through the first few weeks of their life. They're ready to go out in the garden and all your hard work is about to pay off. That is the most heartbreaking time to lose your seedlings, because at that point you've put in all that work, you've spent money on them, you've spent time on them and energy on them, and at that point it may also be too late for you to start more. So you do want to make sure that you do not skip the hardening off process. So when your seedlings are about ready to go into the garden, what you want to do is about a week before you transplant them, you want to gradually start getting them used to going outside. So for example, my plants, the first day that I'm hardening them off, I put them outside on my deck. I put them in a shaded spot on my deck, and I let them sit there for about an hour or so, and that's it. Now the second day, I'll do the same thing, but leave them out a little bit longer. And you want to just kind of increase the amount of time that they're outside each day, increase the type of conditions that they're exposed to. Eventually you'll move them out into the sun. Eventually you can let them sit out overnight, and then you can transplant them into the garden. Giving them that little bit of time to adjust, you'll actually see physical changes in your plants where the leaves get darker green, the leaves get thicker and tougher. You can actually see that your plants are a lot more acclimated to the weather and ready to handle whatever nature is going to throw at them. So definitely make sure you do not skip that hardening off step. So I hope that this information was helpful to you. I know it can feel kind of overwhelming sometimes to think of all the things that could go wrong starting your seeds. And honestly, if you're just starting, things probably will go wrong, but you know what, that's okay. And a lot of times, even if things do go wrong, a lot of times your seedlings will recover and end up doing just fine. So I definitely encourage you to start your seeds. Sometimes knowing the common mistakes that you could make, sometimes just knowing what those mistakes are is enough to avoid actually making those mistakes. So I hope that this is helpful to you. I hope that you feel a little more equipped and ready to dive into the world of seed starting. I promise you, it is kind of addicting once you start your seeds and you see the variety that's out there and what you can grow when you're starting from seed rather than only buying transplants at the store. It's like a whole new world, and I promise you, once you get the hang of it, you will do it every year. So again, thank you for hanging out with me today. I hope that this was helpful information. If you have more questions about seed starting, go ahead and leave those in the comments below, and I will do my best to try to help you. If you're an experienced gardener and you thought of some other seed starting mistakes that I missed in this video, can you share those in the comments too? Because I'm sure everyone would love to learn from your knowledge as well. So I hope you guys are having a great day. I hope that you're inspired to start some seeds and just have an amazing gardening year. All right, guys, I hope you're having a great day, and I'll talk to you later. See you next time.